poor boy saved the life of a young millionaire, the request that transformed the family forever. You never imagined that something like this could happen to you. I grew up believing that life was easy, simple. I had everything a teenager could dream of. My father, George Richards, was always an imposing figure, one of the most powerful men in New York business. And I, the spoiled only daughter, surrounded by luxury and comfort. But at that time, I still didn't know that behind all that wealth, there was something that even money couldn't buy. I remember exactly the day everything started to fall apart. It was a sunny day, and I had just returned from a trip with some friends. I should have been happy, but there was a strange feeling of tiredness that wouldn't leave me. I thought it was just the rush of everyday life. Teenage life was busy, full of parties, events, and expectations. But as the days went by, this tiredness began to turn into something darker. First came the dizziness, the feeling that the world was spinning too fast, even when I was still. With each step, it felt like the ground disappeared beneath my feet. Soon after, the purple spots started on my body. I saw them appear inexplicably on my arms, on my legs, as if my body was breaking down inside. I tried to hide it from my parents at first. I didn't want them to worry, and to be honest, I was in denial myself. But it didn't take long for the inevitable to happen. One day, during a family gathering, I fainted. Everything around me went dark, and when I woke up, I was in a hospital. The white lights, the sounds of machines, the sterile smell of medicines. That's where the nightmare began to unfold. Leukemia. That was the word that changed my life forever. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but from the look in the doctor's eyes and the sudden silence in the room, I knew my life was about to change in ways I had never imagined. They began to explain the details. Leukemia was a type of blood cancer, and my body was betraying me, slowly destroying me from the inside. Soon, I started the treatments. What followed was a nightmare that I could not have predicted in my worst dreams. The chemotherapy was devastating. Imagine your body being consumed from within, your healthy cells destroyed alongside your sick ones, without mercy. In the first few days, I felt the side effects. My appetite disappeared, and with it, the weight I had. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a different version of myself, a paler, weaker, more distant version of who I used to be. But nothing prepared me for the moment my hair started falling out. I remember the first strand I found on the pillow. It was like a part of me was dying. I took that strand in my hands, in disbelief, and stared at it for minutes. When I ran my hand through my hair, more strands began to come loose, as if they were giving up the fight. It was a constant reminder that my body was losing a battle I barely understood. Every day, more and more hairs came loose. When I showered, I saw my head exposed, more skin than hair, and the water took with it pieces of who I was. A vain girl, proud of her long brown hair, now found herself helpless, holding strands in her hands as if they were parts of a life that was slipping away. One day, I decided I couldn't take this daily torture any longer. I called my mother and asked her to shave off the rest. I didn't want to watch the slow process of seeing everything disappear. I wanted to get it over with once and for all. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror, a shiny bald spot where there used to be bouncy hair, it was as if I had finally accepted that this disease was taking over me. The shock was visceral. I was no longer the Helen everyone knew. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The weakness, the paleness, the weight that disappeared every week. It was as if my soul was being drained along with the illness. I didn't have the energy to get out of bed, and when I did, the fatigue hit me like a punch, making every move feel like a marathon. My bones hurt. They hurt in a way I can't describe. It was a pain that went beyond the physical, as if it were ingrained in my being, sucking out every trace of vitality I still had. I remember looking at my thin hands, the bluish veins visible against the translucent skin, and thinking about how I was transforming into something unrecognizable. Mirrors became my enemies. I avoided walking past them. I hated what I saw reflected back. The clothes that used to fit me now hung limply on my body, a cruel reminder that I was shrinking, literally disappearing. Worst of all was the feeling of helplessness. There was nothing I could do to fight it. I was at the mercy of something invisible and relentless, which devoured my body from the inside and left only the crumbs of who I used to be. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't even do that. I wanted to cry, but even the tears seemed to have abandoned me. And my father? He was physically present, but emotionally, he was still far away. He continued dealing with business, meetings, million-dollar transactions, as if nothing was happening. For him, everything seemed like a matter of solving. He believed he could buy the cure, buy my health back, but all the money in the world couldn't take away what leukemia was doing to me. I was losing more than my health. I was losing my identity, my sense of who I was. I, Helen Richards, daughter of a millionaire, had everything, but at the same time, I had nothing. I had no strength. I had no hope. With each passing day, I felt like I was disappearing, and no one around me seemed to understand how desperate that was. No one except Gabriel. But I didn't know that yet. There was no way to prepare for what came next. When illness entered my life, it didn't just strip me of who I was. It began to devour who I believed I could be. With each day that passed, I felt a little more of my life being drained away, and despair took over me like a shadow that refused to leave me. Sometimes I felt like I was on the verge of giving up, but something in me, no matter how small, kept fighting. Leukemia wasn't just a disease in my blood, it was in every aspect of my life. I couldn't escape her, not even for a second. Each morning, when I tried to get out of bed, the weight of weakness kept me there, trapped between sleep and fear. My mother tried to help me, always with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, holding my hand with a strength that I knew was forced. She was trying to be strong for me, but I could see the fear in her eyes. With each visit to the doctor, I saw her shrink, each test result in an invisible knife cutting our hopes into pieces. The treatments were worse than I imagined. If you've never experienced this, it's impossible to describe what chemotherapy does to your body. It's as if your body turns into a battlefield, every cell, every piece of you being attacked at the same time. I vomited even when I had nothing left in my stomach. The nausea was constant, a suffocating feeling that never seemed to leave me. I felt the metallic taste of chemicals in my mouth. The smell of medicine permeated everything around me. The hospital became a prison. The silent corridors, the rooms smelling of disinfectant, the uncomfortable beds. Nothing there seemed welcoming. I remember trying to hold down a meal, any meal. It was always soup, thin, tasteless, almost liquid soup that I could barely swallow. At first, my mother tried to encourage me, saying that I needed to eat to gain strength. But soon, even she gave up forcing food. I was losing weight so quickly that I sometimes wondered if my soul was also disintegrating along with my body. My bones began to stand out beneath my skin, as if my body was disappearing from the inside out. The worst part, however, wasn't the physical pain. It was loneliness. No matter how much my parents were there, no matter how much the doctors and nurses surrounded me, there was a growing abyss inside me. I felt alone, as if no one in the world could understand what I was going through. Every day, the distance between me and my father became more visible. He was always there, with his expensive suits and his look like he could solve anything. But I knew he couldn't reach me. I knew that despite all his attempts, he was lost. I saw him trying to hide his work connections at the hospital, as if he wanted to spare me. But I knew. He never stopped being the great businessman, not even while I was fighting for my life. And I felt angry about that. Anger that he couldn't just be there. Anger because no matter how hard he tried, it seemed like I would never be the priority. For him, everything was a transaction, something that could be resolved with money. And this time, money wasn't helping. The doctors gave us devastating news. I needed a bone marrow transplant. There was no other alternative. The treatment I was receiving was not working as expected. Without a compatible donor, my chances of survival were slim. My mother cried that day like never before. I knew that was his greatest pain, the possibility of losing me. And I, despite being terrified, found myself strangely calm. Maybe it was the tiredness. Maybe it was the fact that I was starting to accept that my life could really end there. My family was tested to see if anyone was a match for me. With each negative result, despair grew more. My aunts, my cousins, even family friends volunteered. Everyone wanted to help, but no one was compatible. I saw hopes dissipate, one by one, and I began to wonder if fate had decided that this was my time. I started dreaming about what would happen next if I left. I thought about my mother, how devastated she would be, how my father, with all his power, would finally find himself powerless. It was a strange feeling, but in a way almost comforting. The idea that if everything ended, the suffering would end with it. But then, amid the silence of the hospital, amid the emptiness I felt spreading, something happened. A campaign was launched. My father, with his influence, managed to move mountains to try to find a donor. Donor banks, advertisements, everything was done. I didn't have much hope, but something unexpected was about to happen. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting chemotherapy session, I heard a different murmur in the hallways. Nurses were whispering among themselves, and the name Gabriel seemed to come out of their mouths. I didn't think much of it at first, as I was too tired to care about anything at that point. But at dusk, my mother entered the room with a different expression. There was a spark of hope in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in weeks. "Helen," she said, her voice shaking. "We found a donor." For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Had we really found someone? I felt so fragile, so defeated, that I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. But it was true, and his name was Gabriel. When he first entered the room, I almost couldn't understand what was happening. Gabriel was an ordinary boy in simple clothes, with an air of humility that completely contrasted with the luxurious hospital we were in. He looked out of place there, like he came from a completely different world than mine. But there was something about him, a kindness, a light, that made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I didn't know much about him at that time, but what I knew was enough. He had volunteered to be tested even without knowing us, even without having any obligation. Gabriel, a boy who barely had enough for himself, was there, offering me the only thing I really needed, a chance to survive. And in that moment, everything changed. I knew that with him by my side, there was a spark of hope. And that spark was all I needed to keep fighting. When Gabriel came into my life, he brought with him something I didn't know I needed: hope. A timid, fragile, almost imperceptible hope, but which somehow began to fill the growing void that the disease had left in me. Until that moment, all I felt was darkness. Every part of my body hurt. Every movement seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 kilos, and the idea of continuing to fight no longer made sense. But Gabriel made me believe, even if for a moment, that maybe I could have a chance. He was so different from anyone I had ever met. I clearly remember the first time our eyes met. I was in the hospital bed, with my head shaved, my body fragile and weakened, without a shred of strength. The room was lit by cold white lights, but it seemed darker than ever. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the beeping of machines around me. When he walked in, I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in weeks: true empathy, a kindness I hadn't expected to find in a stranger. Gabriel was tall, thin, and wore simple clothes, probably the only ones he had. There was an aura of calm around him, a serenity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that maybe I wasn't so alone. He didn't say much on that first visit. He stood near the door, looking a little out of place, as if he didn't quite know what to do in a place like that. I didn't know what to say either. What do you say to the person who is about to save your life? How do you give thanks for something so big, so immeasurable? It was my mother who broke the silence, introducing us with a voice choked with emotion. "Helen, this is Gabriel, the boy who volunteered as your donor." There was a reverence in his voice, as if Gabriel were an angel sent to rescue us from this nightmare. And maybe he was. I smiled, or at least I tried. In fact, my mouth barely moved, as even this simple gesture seemed tiring. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice a faint whisper. The word seemed insufficient, so small in the face of the immensity of what he was doing for me. He just nodded without saying much. It didn't need to. There was a silent understanding between us, as if we knew words weren't necessary at that moment. The days that followed were a mix of preparation and anticipation. The bone marrow transplant was scheduled, and the idea that my life depended on a single surgery terrified me. There was so much at stake. What would happen if something went wrong? What if my body rejected the marrow? These questions haunted my thoughts, stealing my sleep even when I was exhausted beyond what any human being should be. I spent my nights staring at the hospital ceiling, the lights flickering in the dark, and thinking about all the things I never got the chance to do. All the dreams I had left aside. I never imagined life could be so short. I was only 16. When you're 16, you think you have all the time in the world. I imagined myself growing up, traveling, meeting people, building a career, maybe even starting my own family one day. But now, all of these seemed so far away, as if they were nothing more than fantasies that I would never have the chance to fulfill. At each exam, at each consultation, I saw the tiredness on my parents' faces, especially on my mother's. She didn't say much, but her eyes were always teary, as if she was one step away from breaking down at any moment. I knew she blamed herself in some way for not being able to do more. When she thought I was asleep, I heard her quiet conversations with the doctors. "She's going to make it, isn't she?" she asked, her voice broken with anguish. And the doctors, always cautious, responded with a diplomacy that irritated me. "We are doing everything we can." But Gabriel, he didn't seem to have any doubts. Every time I came to the hospital, it brought me a kind of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. Sometimes he talked about his life, although I knew he didn't like to expose himself too much. Gabriel was different. He came from a reality so far from mine. While I lived in mansions, surrounded by everything money could buy, he grew up in a neighborhood where even the most basic things were scarce. He told me about his house, small and simple, where he lived with his mother and two younger brothers. And yet I never heard him complain. He spoke with pride about his family, about the daily effort they made to stay together. That's when something started to change in me. I, who had always thought that my life was difficult, that I felt sorry for myself for being in that situation, began to realize that there was something beyond my own suffering. Gabriel, with so little, was giving me everything he had. He was offering the only thing that could save my life, without expecting anything in return. It left me humbled and grateful in a way I had never experienced before. In the days leading up to the surgery, Gabriel visited me every day. Sometimes he would bring little things, like a flower he found on the way, or a simple sweet his mother had made. For someone like me, used to expensive gifts and luxurious travel, these small gestures were invaluable. Every visit from him was a reminder that even in the midst of chaos, there was beauty in the simple things. But at the same time, fear was growing inside me. The closer the day of surgery approached, the more I questioned whether I really deserved a second chance. I didn't know what I would do with this new life that Gabriel was about to give me. Could I transform into someone better? Or would I go back to being the selfish, superficial girl I was before I got sick? The truth is, I didn't know. The day before the surgery, I felt a deep uneasiness. The hours seemed to drag by as I mentally prepared myself for what came next. Deep down, I was terrified. What if I didn't survive the surgery? What if this was the end? I tried to chase away these thoughts, but they clung to me like lingering shadows. I remember Gabriel entering the room that night. He looked at me with that calm look that always made me feel like everything was going to be okay. This time, however, I couldn't hold back the tears. I started to cry, a silent, heavy cry, filled with all the fear and pain that I had kept inside me for so long. Gabriel approached without saying anything and held my hand. His touch was firm and comforting, as if he wanted to convey to me the strength I couldn't find in myself. "It's going to be okay," he said finally, his voice low but full of certainty. And for a brief moment I believed it. That night I slept for the first time in weeks, holding the beaded bracelet he had given me. When the sun rose that morning, everything felt heavier. I woke up with my heart racing, my body sweaty and shaking, and that feeling that the floor could collapse at any moment. It was the day of the surgery, the day when everything could change, or end for good. I was there, lying in the hospital bed, smelling the familiar smell of disinfectant, hearing the rhythmic beeping of the machines around me. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in a dream that I couldn't wake up from. But it was real. It was very real. My mother entered the room before I even had the strength to sit up. Her face was tired. Her eyes were red from crying. She tried to smile, but it was a forced, fragile smile. I knew her well enough to know that inside she was just as scared as I was. At his side, my father remained silent, an austere and distant presence, as if the weight of the situation was so great that he simply didn't know how to deal with it. I couldn't remember the last time I saw him so vulnerable. The surgery was scheduled for a few hours from now. Gabriel was already in the hospital, ready for the procedure that could save my life. The strange thing was that even with all the uncertainty, there was a kind of calm in me, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the fact that I knew that one way or another, this would come to an end. Either I would survive and get a second chance, or I wouldn't. And as scary as that was, there was a clarity in the simplicity of it. My life was about to be placed in the hands of fate, and in Gabriel's hands. My body was weak, exhausted from chemotherapy and weeks of treatment. I had lost so much weight that my bones felt protruding against the mattress, my skin thin and pale as paper. My arms, once full of life, now seemed fragile, almost translucent, with blue veins that stood out. The hair, which had once been my pride, no longer existed. My shaved head was a constant reminder of everything the disease had taken from me. Sometimes I looked in the mirror and could barely recognize myself. Who was that fragile girl, with her distant eyes and weakened body? I didn't know anymore. But deep down, something in me still wanted to fight. It wasn't just a fight for physical survival. It was a fight to find who I was again, who I could be, if I could get out of that hell. When the nurses came to pick me up to prepare me for surgery, I felt a cold spread through my body. They placed me in a wheelchair, and as they took me through the halls, I couldn't stop the tears from silently falling down my face. I tried to be strong for so long, tried to hold everything inside, but in that moment, I allowed myself to feel the magnitude of what was about to happen. I was fighting death, and as much as I tried to be brave, the fear was overwhelming. We passed through several corridors until we reached the pre-operative waiting room. Everything around was a blur, as if I was in a slow-motion movie. The nurses' voices, the noise of hurried footsteps, the tinkling of medical equipment. Everything seemed distant. It was then that suddenly I saw Gabriel. He was waiting there in the hallway, sitting on a plastic chair. As soon as he saw me, he got up and walked towards me, hesitantly, as if he was nervous. And maybe he was. But even so, he had that sparkle in his eyes, a quiet determination that made me feel for a moment that maybe everything really could be okay. He crouched down beside me, his hands holding mine. They were warm, firm, and somehow they brought a little comfort to my tumultuous heart. We were silent for a few seconds, not knowing exactly what to say, but I knew I didn't need words. His presence was enough. He was there, and that was all that mattered. "I promise it will work," Gabriel said, his voice low, almost a whisper. There was a certainty in those words, a confidence that I couldn't fully understand, but that gave me strength. I shook his hand with what little energy I had left and looked at him, trying to smile. But the smile died before it even formed. "I'm scared," I finally admitted, my voice shaking. And in that moment, all the masks I had worn, all the courage I had tried to pretend, crumbled. Gabriel saw my fear, saw my vulnerability, and he didn't back down. He just stood there, holding my hand, giving me some of the strength I no longer had. "I am too," he confessed after a pause. It was the first time he admitted it. I had always seen him as a rock, someone who seemed unshakable. But in that moment, I knew he also carried the weight of that responsibility. He was literally giving me a part of himself, risking his own health to save me. And yet, he was there, firm, without hesitation. Time seemed to stop as we stood there together, in that cold, impersonal hallway. My mother approached silently, placing a hand on my shoulder, and my father stood to one side, but it was Gabriel who kept me centered. He gave me something no one else could, the feeling that I wasn't alone. Soon the doctors arrived to take him to the prep room, and when he let go of my hand, I felt like I was losing my ground. But before he left, he looked at me one last time and said something I'll never forget. "Believe me, Helen, everything's going to be okay." And then he was gone. The hallway fell silent, and suddenly, all the strength I had was gone. My parents were there, but I was alone again, with my own thoughts, my fears, my doubts. What if it didn't work? What if, for some reason, my body rejected the marrow? I tried to push these thoughts away, but they came back stronger each time. I was so tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of hoping. Tired of pretending that everything would be fine when, deep down, I didn't know if it would. Finally, they took me to the operating room. The feeling of cold in the room was palpable. The bright lights on the ceiling, the metallic sounds of surgical instruments, and the medical staff around them seemed to set the stage for a do-or-die moment. Because in a way, that was exactly what it was. I was shaking when they placed me on the operating table, and the tears started flowing before I could stop them. I felt a gentle hand touch my arm, and I looked to see the nurse smiling gently. "You're strong, Helen," she said, and I wanted to believe her. I really wanted to. The anesthetist came over and explained what was going to happen, but I could barely hear his words. My mind was far away, lost between fear and hope. The sound of the heart monitor next to me filled the heavy silence in the room, and each beat seemed to mark the time I had before I was plunged into the unknown. And then came the moment when everything went dark. The anesthesia took over me, and the last thing I felt before losing consciousness was the crushing weight of uncertainty. Would this be the end, or a new beginning? It was a different, deep silence, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The moment I opened my eyes, I felt lost, as if I were emerging from a dark, unknown place, an abyss I could barely remember. My eyelids felt heavy, and the first thing I noticed was the soft light coming through the bedroom curtains. The room was not the same as the surgery room. I was back in the recovery room, but something felt different. My ears were ringing. The sound of my own heart beating echoed in my ears, and fear flooded every cell in my body again. Was I alive? Had everything gone well? I felt my body, or rather I tried to feel it. I was numb, as if I no longer belonged to me. A weight enveloped my limbs, and for a moment I wondered if I was still myself. The silence around me swallowed me, but then, little by little, other sounds began to form. The soft beeping of machines next to me, the distant whisper of voices in the hallway, and a closer sound. Sobbing. I turned slowly, each movement requiring monumental effort. It was then that I saw my mother, sitting next to my bed, with her face buried in her hands. She was crying softly, her shoulders shaking in a way that broke my heart. I had never seen her so vulnerable, so broken. And in that moment, I realized that my battle wasn't just mine. I wasn't the only one who was struggling. My mother, my father, Gabriel. They were all with me through this storm. And I knew that no matter what happened, I needed to keep fighting for them. "Dad, Mom." My voice came out as a weak, barely audible whisper. It was as if I didn't know how to speak anymore, as if the words were stuck in my throat, along with all the fear and pain I had accumulated over the last few months. She looked up so fast it scared me. His eyes were swollen, red, and when he saw me awake, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and despair. She leaned over me, holding my hand so tightly I felt a stab of pain, but it was a pain I didn't mind feeling. "Helen, oh my God, you're awake." Her voice was hoarse, shaky, like she'd been holding her breath since the moment they took me into surgery. I tried to smile, but my body didn't seem to want to cooperate. I'm here," was all I managed to say, my throat dry and scratchy. Those weren't the words I wanted to say. I wanted to ask about the surgery. I wanted to know if everything had gone well. I wanted to know about Gabriel. But at that moment, all that mattered was that I was alive. I felt the air in my lungs, and that, in itself, was a miracle. My mother caressed my face, her hands shaking as much as her voice. "You did it, Helen. The surgery was a success." She was trying to control her tears, but I knew the relief was weighing on her like a tidal wave about to crash. "The doctor said that now we just have to wait, but everything indicates that you will be fine." For a moment, her words didn't make sense. Like this? Had it worked? Did I really have a chance? Did I survive the surgery? It was as if a monumental weight had been lifted from my chest, but at the same time, a new charge of emotion hit me with full force. Tears began to well up in my eyes, silent but intense. I had fought so hard, suffered so much, and suddenly, there I was, halfway between life and death, being pulled back to the side of the living. "Gabriel? And Gabriel?" I managed to ask, concern for him growing in me. I hadn't forgotten the sacrifice he made for me. He gave me a part of himself, something that could have consequences for him too. I needed to know if he was okay. My mother glanced at the door, and then, as if she had been waiting for that moment, Gabriel entered. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his face pale, but still, there was that sparkle in his eyes. That sparkle that always seemed to tell me things were going to be okay, even when the world around me was falling apart. He approached slowly, almost as if he were afraid of waking me from a deep sleep. But when our eyes met, I felt a wave of gratitude so strong I could barely contain it. He smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. He was there, whole, and he had saved me. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to thank him. I wanted to tell him how much he meant to me, how much he changed my life. But the words were lost before I could say them. All I could do was extend my hand toward him. He took her with the same firmness as always. And in that touch, in that simple gesture, all the unspoken words were understood. "I told you it was going to be okay," Gabriel said, his voice calm but filled with an emotion that made me want to cry even more. He was there by my side, as promised. The days that followed were a blur of recovery. The doctors constantly came to examine me, checking every little sign, every reaction of my body to the new marrow. I was far from out of the woods. There was still the risk of rejection, and my body needed time to accept what had been transplanted. I knew the next few months would be critical, but there was a difference now. I had hope, and that was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gabriel came to visit me every day, and little by little I began to learn more about him. He was the opposite of everything I knew. I grew up in a poor neighborhood, far from the luxury and facilities that had always been part of my life. He never had anything easy, and yet, he was there, offering the most precious thing anyone could give, a second chance. He didn't want anything in return, and that was what touched me most. He didn't expect recognition, nor rewards. He just wanted to see the result of what he had started. I began to see the world through Gabriel's eyes, and it was a world I had never known. His stories about his childhood, his daily struggle for things I had always taken for granted, opened my eyes in a way nothing else had before. He taught me that true wealth was not in the things we owned, but in the connections we created, in the lives we touched. And I knew that my life, which seemed so fragile, only existed now because of him. Days turned into weeks, and my body slowly began to respond to the treatment. The hair was still a long way from growing back, and the physical and emotional scars were still there, but I knew I was on the right path. The fear was still there, but it was no longer as overwhelming. I was alive, and that was a miracle in itself. One afternoon, as the sun set outside the hospital window, Gabriel sat next to me, as he did every afternoon. I looked at him, and finally found the words I had been holding on to for so long. "Thank you, Gabriel. You gave me my life back." He smiled lightly, that modest smile that I already knew so well. "It was you who fought, Helen. I only gave a part of myself. The rest was you." And at that moment, I understood that he was right. The fight had been mine, but without him, I wouldn't be there. Gabriel was not just my donor. He was the reason I still had a story to tell. The first day I was able to get out of bed on my own was a milestone. Small, almost imperceptible to those observing me from the outside, but for me, it was as if I were climbing a mountain. I barely recognized myself. My body, still fragile and weakened, shook with each step, as if it were carrying the weight of all the suffering I had accumulated in the last few months. My legs, so thin they looked like toothpicks, could barely support my own weight, but I stood firm. I had to do this. I had to prove to myself that the fight was not in vain. The feeling of standing, even for a few minutes, was almost supernatural. The world around me seemed different, as if the furniture, the hospital walls, the lights, everything had taken on a new meaning. I wasn't just physically standing. For the first time in months, I felt truly alive. Fear still haunted my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave me alone. But there was something stronger inside me now, something that Gabriel had awakened, Gabriel, my angel in worn-out jeans and a faded t-shirt, was there at that moment, of course. He seemed to always be around, even when I didn't realize it. There was a calmness in his eyes that gave me strength, as if, when he watched me, he knew exactly what I needed, even without me saying a word. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching me with a discreet smile on his lips. There was no need to say anything. He knew. I knew. That step, that simple act of getting out of bed alone, was more than a physical movement. It was the beginning of something new. The days that followed were a mix of small victories and big challenges. Although the doctors were optimistic, we knew the risk of rejection still hung over me like an invisible sword. Each exam, each consultation session brought with it overwhelming anxiety. It was like walking a tightrope, not knowing if the next step would be the one that would knock me down or the one that would take me to the other side. My mother was always there for me, trying to be strong, but I could see how it devastated her. The deep, dark circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights, and her hands shook constantly when she held mine. She smiled at me every day, that encouraging smile of a mother who wants to protect you from everything. But inside, I knew she was in pieces. And my father, well, my father was changed. During the entire process, he seemed to have transformed. The man who used to live with his cell phone attached to his ear, with 1,000 meetings and million-dollar transactions on his mind, now spent hours by my side, in silence, holding my hand, speechless. He was there in a way I would never have expected. It was as if he finally understood that there were things in life that couldn't be bought, controlled, or resolved with a check signature. I saw him cry for the first time. He tried to hide it, as if it was something he had no right to feel. After all, it was my suffering, my battle. But one day, while we were alone in the room, it broke. Holding my hand in both of his, with his gaze fixed on the floor, he let the tears fall silently. "I'm so sorry, Helen," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, for everything." Those words, so full of pain and regret, broke something inside me too. For so long I harbored hurt, anger at him for being so distant, for always choosing work over me. But in that moment I saw the man he truly was, a father who, despite all his mistakes, loved me and was learning to be there. I held his hands and squeezed without saying anything. I knew I didn't need words. He was already fighting his own internal battle, and somehow we were both learning to survive together. As for Gabriel, he continued to be my anchor. Every day he came to visit me. Sometimes we were silent, simply enjoying each other's presence. Other times he would tell me stories about his childhood, the neighborhood where he grew up, the difficulties he faced. It was a world so different from my own that at first I had trouble fully understanding. But the more I listened, the more I understood what really mattered in life. I felt ashamed when I realized how limited my worldview was before the illness. I lived in a golden palace, where everything seemed possible, where problems could be solved with money and influence. But Gabriel showed me that there was a kind of richness that I had never understood, a richness that was not in possessions, but in connections, in generosity, in empathy. He never expected anything in return. He never asked for favors or thanks. He gave me life, without demanding anything other than that I live it fully. It hit me deeply, and I knew I could never repay him for what he did for me. But somehow I wanted to honor that. I wanted to do justice to the sacrifice he made. A few weeks after surgery, I started taking my first steps outside the room. The hospital hallways were familiar, but at the same time, everything felt different. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt warmer, more welcoming. Every breath I took seemed to have more meaning. The small things, like the smell of flowers a nurse brought into the hallway, the distant sound of conversations, everything seemed to take on new importance. I was alive, and that was a miracle I couldn't ignore. One day, Gabriel and I decided to walk to the hospital garden. It was a sunny afternoon, and I felt the cool air on my face for the first time in months. The wind ruffled the scarf I was wearing to cover my head, and for a brief moment I felt a wave of shame. I still hadn't gotten used to my appearance, with the absence of the hair that I once admired so much. But Gabriel looked at me with that warm smile and said bluntly, "You look beautiful, Helen." I knew he was sincere. It wasn't just an empty compliment to make me feel better. There was something about the way he looked at me, an unconditional acceptance, an understanding that went beyond appearance. And at that moment, something changed inside me. For the first time in a long time, I felt beautiful. Not because of how I looked, but because of who I was becoming. We sat on a bench in the garden, in silence, watching the movement of the trees and the songs of the birds. The world around us seemed calmer, as if the worst of the storm had passed. I didn't know what the future held. There was still uncertainty. There was still fear. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trapped by these worries. I was just alive. When I looked at Gabriel, sitting next to me, with the sun falling softly on his face, I felt a wave of gratitude so deep that words almost failed me. "Thank you," I said, my voice shaking. "For everything. I don't know how to repay you." He shook his head softly, the smile still on his face. "You don't need to give back, Helen. Just live. That's enough." And I knew he was right. At that moment, under the clear sky and the heat of the sun, I understood that being reborn was not just about surviving the disease. It was rediscovering life, seeing its colors with new eyes, and living with the intensity that before I had never known was possible. Recovery, as I soon realized, wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. Every day that passed, I learned something new about myself, about life, and, most of all, about the value of the people around me. What the disease had ripped from me, Gabriel helped me rebuild. Little by little, brick by brick, I started to get back on my feet. But the road to this new version of myself was long, painful, and at times, almost unbearable. Every morning, my body felt weak, still worn out from the months of battle that had passed. Getting out of bed was a constant reminder of the fragility my body still carried. Every muscle felt sore, and the fatigue was a faithful companion, never leaving me completely. I knew the cure wouldn't come all at once. It would arrive slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, but present. One day, perhaps, I would wake up and realize that the body that supported me was no longer so weak. But at that moment, every step was a challenge. Still, I continued. I needed to continue. There was something inside me that refused to give up. Something that wasn't there before the illness, before the fight. Gabriel had taught me that. He had shown me, by his silent example, that there is much more to life than just surviving. And I was beginning to understand. But no matter how determined she was, there were dark days. Moments when the weight of the experience suffocated me. It was hard to look in the mirror and see who I had become. Still without hair, still too thin, still full of scars that told the story of a war that I barely survived. I saw myself as a shadow of the person I once was. My reflection was a constant reminder of what I had lost. And sometimes that was hard to bear. I remember one evening in particular, a few weeks after my first walk in the garden. The hospital was quiet, the lights dimmed, the sound of the monitoring machines beside me creating a monotonous rhythm. I was alone in the room and the silence seemed louder than anything I had ever heard. My parents had come home that night after weeks of sleeping next to me. They needed a break too, and I encouraged them to go. But as soon as they were far away, I felt emptiness taking over me. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to shake off my thoughts. But they came, one after another, like relentless waves, dragging me into the darkness. The memories of pain, of illness, of times when I thought I wouldn't survive, all of it came flooding back with frightening intensity. I closed my eyes, trying to chase away the tears, but they fell, silent, hot, as if carrying all the weight I had accumulated over the last few months. I wanted to be strong, I wanted to be brave, but that night, fragility won. I spent hours crying softly, feeling the fear and sadness consume me, as if the disease, even after the surgery, was still there, eating away at me inside. It was like something was trying to pull me back to that dark place where I had no control, where all that existed was pain and uncertainty. I didn't know what to do. And for the first time since I started getting better, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't strong enough to handle all of this. Maybe I would have survived the surgery, but I didn't know if I was ready to really live after that. And it was at that moment, when I was about to sink completely, that the door to my room opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance, nor was it a fanfare. The door just slowly opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was Gabriel. He had come to visit me like he did every day, but something on his face changed as soon as he saw me. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, watching me, as if he could feel the weight of my pain. With slow steps, he entered and approached my bed. He didn't ask what was wrong, nor did he try to comfort me with words. Instead, he simply sat down next to me, took my hand, and held it. And in that touch, all my despair seemed to be absorbed. Not because he could solve my problems, but because he was there. Because he understood. "I know what it's like," he whispered after a long time, his voice low, barely audible in the silence of the room. "Sometimes the worst part isn't the physical pain. It's what it leaves behind, the scars that no one sees." I looked at him, my eyes still filled with tears, and I knew he was right. Gabriel had faced his own battles. He had grown up in an environment where the struggle was a constant, not against an illness, but against the difficulties of life. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to carry invisible scars. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," I confessed, my voice shaking. It was difficult to admit. I had been through so much, fought so much, and yet I felt weak, broken. Gabriel shook my hand more firmly. "You're stronger than you think, Helen. I've seen you fight. I've seen you survive something that many wouldn't have endured. You're not broken. You're just rebuilding yourself." His words were like a balm, a calm I didn't know I needed. He didn't promise me that everything would be okay, nor did he tell me that I had to be strong all the time. He just recognized my pain, accepted my fragility, and gave me the space to be human. That was all I needed that night. We spent the rest of the night in silence. Gabriel stayed by my side until I fell asleep, the gentle touch of his hand on mine anchoring me to reality, keeping me from falling into the abyss of hopelessness. When I woke up the next morning, he was gone, but the comfort he provided me stayed with me. From that moment on, something changed inside me. It wasn't an immediate or dramatic transformation, but a small spark of acceptance. I started to realize that it was okay to be vulnerable. There was no shame in admitting that I was scared, that I was still hurt. I didn't need to be invincible. I just needed to keep trying, one day at a time. The following weeks were slow but full of small progress. Little by little, I started to gain weight again, and my body, although still weak, began to show signs of recovery. The hair, which I so feared I would never see again, began to grow, strand by strand, like a promise that life was returning. My scars, although always present, began to turn into battle marks, no longer reminders of pain. But what changed most was my worldview. Gabriel had given me a gift that I would never be able to return. He taught me that true strength is not in being invulnerable, but in recognizing your weaknesses and continuing anyway. And day after day, I started to see this in myself. The pain I felt, both physical and emotional, did not disappear all at once. But over time, I began to understand that this pain was part of my journey. She shaped me, transformed me. I was no longer the same Helen who once had everything. I was someone different, someone who had seen the darker side of life and come back to tell the story. And now, more than ever, I wanted to live this new life, not just survive. One morning I opened my eyes, and for the first time in months, I felt something different. It wasn't the usual pain that greeted me as soon as I woke up, nor the overwhelming tiredness that made me dread the start of a new day. It was lightness. A lightness that I hadn't felt in so long, that I almost didn't recognize. For a moment I thought maybe it was a dream. But when my feet touched the cold floor and my toes felt the weight of the body, I knew it was real. I was starting to feel alive again, for real. I got up more easily than before. The effort was still enormous, and my body was still fragile, but something had changed. A spark, a small flame that refused to be extinguished, even after everything. I looked into the mirror that reflected a version of me I barely recognized. The scars were still there, the paleness still marked my face, and the hair was still just a small, soft growth on my head. But my eyes were different. I saw something in them that wasn't there before. Strength. A strength that, until then, I didn't know I possessed. Every day, I felt this strength growing, taking root within me in a new way. It was as if my body, little by little, was learning to live again. But more than that, it was my mind that was healing. Each small victory, the first step without assistance, the first genuine smile, the first time I was able to walk down the hospital hallway alone, was proof that I was coming back to life. And at the same time, I knew I would never be the same Helen I was before. And that scared me as much as it relieved me. However, the real internal battle was just beginning. As much as I wanted to leave the pain and trauma behind, they followed me, like shadows that refused to disappear. Even with Gabriel by my side, even with my family supporting me, there were times when I felt completely lost, trapped in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. Sometimes it was hard to believe that I was actually healing. The disease, even though it was silent now, always seemed to be lurking, like an enemy that would never leave me alone. One day, at one of my many appointments, I sat in the doctor's office, listening intently as he explained the results of my most recent tests. "Your recovery is going well, Helen," he said with an encouraging smile. "But you still need to be careful. The risk of rejection may decrease over time, but it never completely disappears." Those words echoed in my mind. It never disappears completely. Even after all the progress, even after all the suffering and struggle, there was always that uncertainty, that threat hanging over me. I tried to swallow the fear that was beginning to form in my chest, but it was relentless. How could I live fully, knowing that this shadow could always return? How could I find peace? I thought about it for days, trying to process what it meant to live with this constant threat. The truth was that leukemia robbed me of more than my physical health. She had robbed me of my peace of mind. Before the illness, I was invincible, or at least I felt that way. Life seemed endless, full of possibilities, with plenty of time to accomplish anything. But the disease showed me otherwise. She made me understand the fragility of life, how quickly everything can be taken from you without warning. And now, even with a cure within reach, I was at the mercy of something I couldn't control. It was on one of these nights, as fear and doubt consumed me, that Gabriel visited me again. He always seemed to know when I needed him, even without me saying anything. He entered the room slowly with that calm and observant look that I so admired. He sat next to me, as he often did, and we sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the gentle sound of the wind outside. "You seem worried," he finally said, his voice low but firm. I knew he already knew the reason, but still, he wanted to give me the space to speak. I sighed, feeling the weight of all my worries pile up. "It's fear," I admitted. Afraid that all of this, that my recovery, all the progress, could disappear at any moment. I don't know how to live with this. How to carry on, knowing that there is always this possibility that the disease will return. Gabriel was silent for a few moments, as if he were choosing his words carefully. He looked at me with an intensity that made my heart sink. "Helen," he began, "you have already survived the hardest thing anyone could face. You looked death in the eye and chose to live. And living, with all its uncertainties, is an act of courage." His words hit me deeply. I had never thought of it that way. I always viewed my recovery as a task to be completed, a goal to be achieved. But he was right. Living, even without guarantees, was an act of courage. Each day that I chose to get out of bed, face my fears, and fight through the pain was a reminder that I was strong, that I could continue, even without knowing what the future would bring. He continued, "I know the fear is still there, and it always will be. But that doesn't mean you can't live. Don't let fear rob you of what you've already achieved. Life is full of uncertainty, but that doesn't make it any less valuable. You still have a lot to offer, a lot to experience, a lot to live for." I felt tears well up in my eyes as I listened to his words. Gabriel, with so little, gave me everything. His wisdom, his kindness, his way of seeing the world. All of this inspired me. He was a constant reminder that life is precious, even when it doesn't seem perfect. He knew what it was like to live with hardship, and yet he lived with an intensity that I was still learning to cultivate. "I don't know what I would do without you, Gabriel," I confessed, my voice shaking with emotion. "You saved me in so many ways, not just with the transplant, but with everything. With who you are." He smiled, that calm, serene smile that always gave me comfort. "I didn't do anything but be here. You saved yourself, Helen. The strength was always inside you. I just helped you see that." At that moment, something inside me lit up. An understanding, an acceptance. I would never be the same person I was before leukemia, and that was okay. I didn't need to be. The Helen who was reborn from the ashes of that illness was stronger, more empathetic, more alive than I ever was. And I knew that no matter what the future brought, I would be ready to face it. The following days were a kind of rebirth. I started to see every moment, every small achievement as a victory. I learned not to demand perfection from myself. I learned to forgive myself for the days when fear still paralyzed me. And most importantly, I learned to live with uncertainty, to embrace the fact that there are no guarantees in life. And maybe that was what made it all more precious. The surgery scar, which I had previously seen as a symbol of weakness, began to transform into a reminder of what I had overcome. Every mark on my body, every strand of hair that slowly grew, was proof that I was alive. I had a second chance, and this time, I was determined to truly live. Gabriel remained by my side, as always, a friend, a confidant, someone I knew I could count on. And together, we began to plan the future. An uncertain future, yes, but full of possibilities. Life was out there, waiting for me, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to live it. As I began to feel stronger, I realized there was one issue I had been avoiding throughout my recovery: my father. George Richards, the powerful man and millionaire who was always present in the headlines of newspapers and business magazines, but rarely present in my life. During the first few months of my illness, he had been a distant figure, someone who appeared frequently physically, but was always absent emotionally. Work, meetings, the corporate world, these were his priorities. Even so, in the most critical moments, he was there. He didn't abandon my mother or leave me alone. He cared for me in his own way, struggling to understand the scale of the situation. But the truth is, since I started healing, the two of us have drifted even further apart. There was a growing chasm between us, and I didn't know how to cross it. Maybe I was scared that he would never change, or maybe I was still hurting from all the times he wasn't there when I needed him most. But as my physical strength returned, I knew I couldn't continue to ignore this void between us. Gabriel had taught me about the importance of human connections, about how people can transform and how relationships can be rebuilt, even in the most difficult circumstances. I wanted to believe this was possible with my father. I needed to believe that. It was on a Sunday afternoon that I decided to face it. We were finally home after so long in the hospital. The mansion's windows let in sunlight, but to me, everything felt a little empty. The grandeur of the house that I once saw as a symbol of security now seemed cold, impersonal. Maybe because now I knew that material things couldn't fulfill what really mattered. I was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, watching the raindrops begin to hit the large glass windows. My father was in the office as usual. Even after all the events, he still couldn't completely disconnect from work. I felt a mix of frustration and sadness. Had he not yet learned? Had everything we experienced not been enough for him to see what really mattered? I got up slowly, still feeling tired in my body, and walked to the office. The door was ajar, and the soft sound of her voice on the phone filled the hallway. He was discussing something about investments, about a merger of companies, the kind of conversation he always had. I stood still for a few seconds, listening, and something inside me broke. I realized that despite everything I'd been through, he was still trapped in that world. He hadn't changed, at least not completely. But I also knew that I couldn't change my father, not with words, not with demands. The only thing I could do was be honest about how I felt. That's what Gabriel always told me. Sometimes silence can keep things unchanged, but the truth, however painful it may be, is the first step to change. So I knocked on the door and went in. My father stopped the call immediately upon seeing me. "Helen." He looked surprised, maybe even a little guilty at being caught in the middle of yet another business conversation. He hung up the phone quickly and stood up from the leather chair, trying to appear more present than he was. "I was just finishing up a call, honey. How are you feeling today?" he asked, in that warm voice he always used when he was trying to be the present father, but which never seemed to get to the real heart of the matter. I watched him for a moment, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the man behind the unbeatable businessman facade. My father looked older, more tired. The deep circles under his eyes and the gray hair that had previously been just occasional now dominated his appearance. He had aged rapidly over the past few months. Maybe his battle was as internal as mine. "Dad," I began, feeling my voice shaking. "I need to talk to you." He looked worried, almost scared. Sure, sit down," I said, pointing to the armchair in front of me. I sat down, and for a long moment I said nothing. He was silent too, waiting for me to speak, but there was a tension in the air, as if we both knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. All the time I was sick, I saw you, trying in some way to be there. But what I want to say, Dad, is that you're not here yet. Not really. He opened his mouth to say something, but I raised my hand, asking him to let me finish. "I'm not saying this to hurt you, but I've been on the brink of death. And through this whole process, I've learned that the things that really matter in life aren't the things you can buy or control. I saw people around me, people like Gabriel, who have so little materially, but who have everything that really matters: love, compassion, presence. And that's what I miss with you." My father's expression changed. He no longer looked like the confident businessman. He looked like a broken man, perhaps for the first time, seeing his daughter not as someone who needed to be protected or provided with material goods, but as someone who needed him in a much deeper way. "Helen," he began, his voice hoarse, I know I failed you. I don't know how to reconcile who I am with the father you need. I've tried, but it seems I always seem to get it all wrong." Tears started to fall from his eyes, something I never thought I would see. My father, the man who never showed weakness, was crying in front of me, completely broken down. "I spent so much time building a life that I thought was what you and your mother needed. But I lost what was most important in the process. I lost time with you. I lost the chance to be your father." Seeing my father like this, stripped of all his masks, was like a wound that finally began to heal. I wanted to cry with him. I wanted to hug him and tell him everything was okay. But at the same time, I knew that wasn't enough. He needed to understand that the change had to be real, not temporary. "I forgive you, Father," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But I need you here. I need you to be there. I no longer want a father who buys the world, but a father who is in my world. I don't need anything material. I just need you." He stood up, walked around the table and knelt beside me, holding my hands tightly. "I will change, Helen, I promise. For you, for us." And in that moment, I knew there was hope. My father, for the first time, was willing to reconnect, willing to learn to be the man and father he had never known how to be. The relationship between us was still broken in some ways, but that day, we took the first step towards rebuilding what we had lost. And that, more than any promise, was what gave me the strength to believe that everything could, in fact, be okay. A few months had passed since the conversation with my father, and a lot had changed. It wasn't just my body that was healing. My life as a whole was in the process of transformation. Everything around me felt different, but more importantly, I was also changed. I was a new person, and a big part of that transformation came from someone I would never have expected to have such a profound impact: Gabriel. It was a sunny day when my father and I decided to do something we had never done before. Go out together without business plans, without the need to appear perfect to others. Just the two of us, sharing a moment. We went to a park, something so simple, but so meaningful. I could feel the lightness in the air, a silent connection between us. It was as if we were, little by little, rebuilding the pieces of the relationship that the illness, emotional distance, and time had broken. As we walked, I started thinking about everything that had happened since I was diagnosed. The memories were still vivid, the fear, the pain, the isolation. But at the same time, there was now a sense of gratitude mixed in with it all. Gratitude for being alive, for having a second chance, and gratitude mainly for Gabriel. He changed our lives in ways none of us could have predicted. When I think of him, I'm still amazed at the depth of his kindness. Gabriel, the boy who grew up in a poor neighborhood, who lived with so little, but who had so much to offer. He didn't just save my life with the bone marrow transplant. He saved my soul. He showed me what's really important. As we walked in the park, I turned to my father. He looked different, more relaxed, almost unrecognizable from the man who once lived only for business. During my recovery, he had really changed. I saw him more often at home, participating in family meals, interested in talking about my day, about how I was feeling. He had begun to put aside the incessant race for success, something that had always consumed him, and began to prioritize the things that really mattered. Our family. "You're thoughtful," my father commented, breaking the silence. I smiled, taking a deep breath of the fresh park air. I was thinking about how everything changed, how I changed, and most importantly, how Gabriel changed our lives. My father nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if he too was processing the impact Gabriel had on us. "He's a special boy. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay him for what he did for you, for us." There was truth in my father's words. Gabriel, with his act of pure generosity, had touched our lives in ways that money could never achieve. My father, a man who built his empire on the belief that success and happiness came from material achievement, had finally learned that the truest value in life is not in possessions but in human connections. I remember the first time my father met Gabriel. He didn't know how to react. Used to dealing with transactions, figures, and negotiations, the idea of someone making such a huge sacrifice without expecting anything in return seemed incomprehensible to him. But over time, he began to understand. Gabriel didn't want money or favors. He wanted something much simpler and at the same time, infinitely more precious. He wanted me to live. This act of generosity, coming from a boy who barely had enough for himself, shook the foundations of the life my father had built. For a man who always believed that everything could be bought, the discovery that something as essential as life and hope could not be purchased with money was an awakening. Gabriel's simple gesture broke down the barriers that my father had built over the years and made him see what really mattered. He had saved more than just my life. He had saved our family. My father and I continued walking in silence, but there was a peace between us. The kind of peace that comes when you finally understand that everything you need is within your reach, if you only know where to look. And I knew that Gabriel had been the key to that understanding. He opened our eyes to a new way of seeing the world. The following week, we decided to do something I knew was necessary. We went to visit Gabriel. I wanted to thank him again, but more than that, I wanted him to see the impact his kindness had left on us. We arrived at his house in the early afternoon. It was a simple house in a modest neighborhood, but to me, that didn't matter. I knew that there, in that simplicity, there was a richness that many didn't understand. Gabriel welcomed us with his usual smile, that calm smile that somehow made everything seem easier. He invited us in, and as we sat down at the table, I felt deep gratitude flood my heart. There was something magical about his presence, something that made me feel like no matter what happened, everything would be okay. As we talked, my father looked directly at Gabriel, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much you changed us, Gabriel. How much you changed our worldview. How much you changed me. I spent my entire life believing that money was the only thing that really mattered. But you showed me that I was wrong. You showed me that there are things that money can never buy, like love, time, life." Gabriel just smiled slightly, as if my father's words were something he already knew, but didn't need to hear out loud. "I've done nothing but help when you needed it. Sometimes all someone needs is a chance." I looked at Gabriel, my heart heavy with gratitude. "You gave us more than a chance, Gabriel. You gave us life, and I will never forget that. The visit was brief, but it left a lasting impact. As we returned home, I realized that of all the lessons the illness taught me, the most important was about the power of generosity, empathy, and human connection. Gabriel, with his humble heart, had transformed the lives of a wealthy family who, until then, believed they already had everything. That night, as I reflected on everything that happened, I realized that Gabriel wasn't just a boy who helped me survive. He was a living example that true wealth is not in what we accumulate, but in what we give. He showed us that the biggest changes come from the most unexpected places, and that the impact of a single act of kindness can echo throughout a lifetime. And so the message that has stuck with me, a message that I hope everyone who hears my story can take away with them, is that life, with all its uncertainties and challenges, is worth living not for what we can get, but for what we can offer to others. And that sometimes the greatest transformations come from where we least expect it. Like a poor boy, who saved not just one life, but transformed the hearts of an entire family. Sometimes the greatest riches in life do not come from the material goods we accumulate, but from the gestures of love and kindness we offer to others. It was Gabriel, with so little, who taught us that true wealth lies in the connections we make and in the impact that we leave in people's hearts. And it is this lesson that I will always carry with me. What really matters in life cannot be bought, but it can be given from the heart. If you want to receive more stories like this, subscribe and leave your like, and YouTube will understand that you like the channel. See you in the next video.